Hi, and welcome to another episode of Reinventing Your Home. My name is Ross, and this week we're renovating this bedroom. So the first thing we need to do is we need to strip out this old wallpaper, and we have to make some alteration to the electrical system. This cable needs to go, that socket needs to be moved down there. This one's going completely, these two are staying. After that we need to replaster and redecorate throughout. And the last piece of the puzzle is to make a new section for that window. As you can see, it's sloping to one end due to the failure of the mortise and tenon joint. So join me the next half an hour to see how we did that. Whenever you're dealing with wallpaper that was put 20 or more years ago, you never truly know what you're going to find under it once you strip it. So I always say that it's advisable to be prepared to replaster the walls, because the worst case scenario in that case is you don't need to replaster, which is it's a win on its own. However, in here, even though it wasn't terribly bad when we stripped it, we still had to replaster the walls, and I will actually explain to you why, because you can see it very well on the video. So as you can see here, these grey patches appear as I'm stripping the wallpaper, and this is actually paint that's being pulled off with the wallpaper. So in this instance, we could potentially fill those patches with fine filler, sand them down and repaint the walls. However, when there's too many of those, it's really not justified the time to do that. And as well as that, we have to wash the wall with sugar soap a few times, maybe 2 or 3 times, before we can actually fill and repaint. So it's actually much easier to prime the walls and then replaster them, and then also we get a really nicer finish. So this wall was a little bit worse than the rest of them, nothing too bad. As you can see here, they've actually used lining paper under the main wallpaper, and that's why it's taking me a bit longer to strip, because I have to take one layer and then come back and strip the lining paper. That would bring me down to the actual wall. But again, it wasn't too bad. This house was built in the mid 1800s, so I was expecting worse. And this is, now that it's all stripped, you can see all the mess that I've made. So I stripped everything for a few hours, and then I had a round of clear up. After that, as I said to you earlier, we're going to just prime the walls and get them ready for plastering. So this is the primer. I like to use PVA. So this is a bit of a controversial topic when it comes to plastering, because a lot of the new plasterers like to use blue grit, which I'm not opposing using that. I'm not saying it's not nice. I personally haven't used it enough to know how to work with it. So, and PVA has been really good for me, so I really can't complain. I like using PVA for that reason. So if you have a different opinion, feel free to let me know in the comments. However, this is just my personal opinion on the matter. Then we have to put corner beads on all the external corners. We had 3 in this instance here, so we cut the corner bead to size, and then whenever possible I like to use a staple gun. It's just easier to do that way. It just saves you a lot of time. Then the final step of the preparation for plastering is to put scrim tape on all of the cracks that we have. So as you can see here, we have the ceiling that's already been primed, and the primer is dry, and then we have to cover every single crack with that mesh tape. Now unfortunately, the video makes the ceiling look a lot better than it actually was. We had a few cracks, and also it was very lumpy, so those are the 2 reasons why we decided to replaster the ceiling instead of just painting over it. And then we cover all the rest of the cracks. So the idea for that mesh tape is to prevent it from cracking again in the future. So this is the room prepped up, ready for plastering. Then I had one of my jiu-jitsu buddies help me with the electrical work. So this is Tommy, who, as well as a professional MMA fighter, is also an electrician, so that's why he was helping me on this job. We had to remove a light switch inside that cupboard, move this socket down here as well. So that light switch was connected to the cable above the fireplace, so they must have had a wall mounted light at some point. A bit of a weird place to put the light switch, but anyways. So in this particular video, I've decided to focus less on the application method of plastering and actually talk a little bit more on the finishing process, which I believe is a very important one. So what we're having here is we've already done the 2 coats, and then we're doing a process that is known as flattening, which is very self-explanatory. We're just trying to get the plaster flat. At this stage, the plaster would begin to set. So setting means that the plaster starting to go a bit harder, and currently it has a bit of a rubbery consistency that allows us to push in all the trowel marks, fill out any hollow bits, and just get it ready for polishing. Now, personally, I like to use a corner trowel for those internal corners. It's a bit of a controversial topic again in the plastering community. Some people like it, some people don't. Unfortunately, that video is very much out of focus. I did not realize that until I started editing the video, but even so, you can still see how nice and straight corner that gives us. And this is the reason why I like to use the corner trowel. And then in here, this is the final piece of the troweling process before we actually go over with a flexi trowel and polish it. If you don't have a flexi trowel to polish it, it's not a completely necessary process. I do have one, that's why I do it, but even at that stage, you can leave it like that. It's good enough. Nevertheless, I've decided to show you a little bit of the application process, especially because it's something slightly different on this one here. So as you can see, I'm mixing a little bit of multi-finish, but I'm making it slightly thicker than I'd normally do that, and that's because we have to go over those corner beads. And normally a section around 8 to 10 inches around the corner bead takes a little bit more material, so it's quite nice if you have slightly thicker plaster to apply over them. And because these sections of the walls were quite small, I've decided I can do that. I would definitely not advise you to do that if you're having a large wall to cover, because for starters it's going to be very difficult on your shoulder. You have to push in a lot more, and also you can get the wall a bit lumpy. It's you get a nicer finish if the plaster is mixed slightly thinner. However, on these small sections, it could actually be beneficial to mix it a little bit thicker, as that way you don't drop a lot on the floor. But that is a topic of another conversation. Anyway, so the plaster we're using here is called multi-finish, and it's manufactured by British Gypsum. So this is a 2-coat system, and this is just the first of 2 coats that we need to apply. And that is something that I wanted to mention, because I do know a lot of plasterers who claim you can only do 1 coat, and that is untrue. If the manufacturer advises you to do 2 coats, probably a good idea to do 2 coats. It's not going to be the end of the world if you just do 1. However, you will end up with lumpy walls, and that's not something I'm willing to do. Anyhow, as we're waiting for the plaster to dry, we can go ahead and start preparing the woodwork for primer. What we're doing here is we're using a bit of sandpaper to key in the surface so our primer can stick onto. And then we do the same thing with the skirting boards. We have a little bit of plaster residue from plastering the walls. You can tape those skirting boards, but if I normally don't, if I know that I'm going to be repainting them, it's just really a waste of time. So I would clean them with sandpaper, and that way I can also key in the surface. Once this is done, this is a very important part of the process. We hoover up all the edges and everything for that matter, and then we tape up the edge of the carpet against the skirting board. So that would allow us to paint against that skirting board without getting any paint on the carpet. So this is the priming process. I'm using water-based primer. It's one of my favorites, and because this primer is suitable for plaster, we can actually overlap it onto the walls. So that's the reason I'm not cutting in here. I would probably overlap it by about 1/2 inch to 1 inch on the wall. It doesn't really matter. You can use that primer on the walls. I don't, because it's a lot more expensive than using mist coat, but you can. And then we're doing the same thing with the doors. We're going over, we're priming everything. That water-based primer takes about an hour to dry. And this is what our plaster looks now that it's nice and dry and ready to paint. However, before we start painting, there's one thing that we need to do, and that is clean up all the internal edges. So what I'm doing here is I'm going over them with a little bit of sandpaper. This is not deep sanding, it's just so we can clean any small imperfections. It's a nice little detail that a lot of people skip, but trust me, it's better if you do it. It looks a lot nicer once everything has been painted. Then the next step is we need to prime said plaster. The primer I've mentioned before is called mist coat, and it's essentially just regular wall paint. We're using white because white is the cheapest. Really, there's no need to go more expensive with the colored paint. You can, but there's no need to do so. So we're having any regular paint, but we thin it down with water. I usually do it at a ratio at about 50-50. The point of that is we need to have a very thin paint that penetrates the plaster and it kills its suction, so we have a better surface to apply our finished paint. Now this is a process that a lot of people try and skip, because I'm not gonna lie to you, it's kind of gross. It's not the nicest thing you can be doing, especially when it comes to ceilings. This is a very thin and runny paint, so all of the splashes from the roller are going to end up all over your face, or as I call them, the painter's freckles. However, this is a very important process, and I would not advise you to try and skip on that, because if you don't prime the plaster properly, what happens is when you apply the coat of paint, all of the moisture from the paint is being sucked into the plaster, leaving a very thick coat on the walls or ceiling, and over the years that is prone to cracking and peeling. So at some point it's going to be a problem for someone else to deal with. And then once we have all the new plaster primed, we can go ahead and start painting. In this particular room we have a two-color scheme. We have traditional white ceiling and then colored walls, and as you can see here, this is what I'm doing now. I need to apply 2 coats of white paint onto that ceiling. Now it is exactly what you see on the video here. Kind of a boring process. It's just me applying the white paint twice, but I'll spare you most of it because it's kind of boring. But here's a little trick how to get a better finish when you're painting walls. So what I'm using here, it's called a pole sander, and essentially what it is, it's a sanding block that you can attach to any extension pole that you own. It's a cheap thing you can buy from Screwfix, and in here I have it set up with 240 grit sandpaper. The point of that is we're going all over the walls just to remove any small imperfections. It's a nice little touch. We do that in between all of the coats, so we do that before the first coat, and then between the first and second coat we do that again. However, I will save you from watching that because it's exactly the same process. There's no need to see it twice. It's a very simple process. Then we do all of the cutting in before we start rolling the walls. As you can see here, I like to use a cutting in brush. So this is an angled brush specifically designed for cutting in, and then you get the bristles on the side. That way it allows you to get a straight line. Normally when it comes to cutting in the top corners, you get from inside corner and then you pull a straight line out. Personally, when it comes to cutting in, I have a system that it makes a perfect sense to me. However, I understand it may not make sense to you. Anyways, I would still share it with you. So what I normally like to do is I will do the bottom edges first, and then I will do anything I can do without the use of steps, and then the final thing I will do is all of the top edges that require me using steps. So the reason I do that is because I absolutely despise doing the bottom edges. I've got really bad knees from the years of wrestling, and I will try to get this thing out and done first so I don't have to think about it. And then actually I do enjoy cutting in the middle and top sections because it doesn't put a strain on my knees, and it's a nice thing. You can actually start to see how the whole room shapes up, and it's an enjoyable process. When it comes to these small sections here, I carry a mini roller with me. As I'm cutting in, I would roll them as well. You'd probably have to do them with a mini roller anyway. It's not a good thing to try and squeeze a big roller there. And I have kettles that are specifically designed to be used for both brushes and a mini roller, so it kind of makes sense to carry one and just do them on the go. And after that we have to roll all of the walls. So I like to use a big 15-liter bucket, a combination of a 9-inch roller on a pole. So what that allows me to do is I can dip my roller into the bucket, and then I can roll my walls top to bottom without bending too much from the back. Because if this is something you do all day every day, it's gonna save you a lot of back problems. Now when it comes to the 15-liter bucket, a lot of DIYers tend to use those roller trays. and I can't even express my hatred towards them. Those are horrible little things. I've got loads of those, and I usually chuck them in the bin. However, a 15-liter bucket is so much more useful because it's highly unlikely that you'd step into it. Those small roller trays, just the horrible little things that it's very common that you can step on them or you can trip in them and spill some paint. Not to mention that they do not hold a lot of paint, so you constantly have to refill them. So from that point of view, if you can get yourself a 15-liter bucket, it's just gonna make your life so much easier. And also you can get those cut-hole liners. Usually they sell them in Toolstation. You can get them from Johnson's as well. So the role of them is that you can put it over the bucket, put the paint in the bucket liner, and whenever you're done with the paint, you can just clean up the bucket liner, put it in the bin, and then you have a clean bucket. So that is a nice touch. So that's my process of painting walls. And then once we do the walls, we have to go and finish the woodwork. As you know already, we've prepped up the woodwork. It's all been primed and ready to paint. We're using just the basic white eggshell to paint all the doors, skirting boards, and the window. For this project, we had to use oil-based paint, mainly because of the window. So this is a single glazed window. I normally like to use water-based paints. They tend to be very good. However, when you have a single glazed window, condensation is a real problem that you need to consider with them. And water-based paints tend to be not as durable on single glazed windows. So because we had to use oil-based paint on the window, we ended up using oil-based paint all over. Well, this is a nice, very nice and easy way to apply the paint. So I'm using a mini foam roller to apply it, and then I would brush it off. And that way you can get those doors painted a lot quicker than if you just using a brush. Not to mention, the other benefit of using a roller is you don't put too thick of a coat of paint. It kind of limits you to the amount of paint you can use, and it's just about enough and not too much, because with a brush you can put too much and then you can end up with runs, which looks horrible. And then after that is time to paint the skirting board. So here we actually have to cut in and get a nice and straight line. With that finished, we are done on site for the time being, and we have to go to the workshop for a few days to make several things, the window being one of those. So this is the process here. We start by cutting some sapele. The old window for some reason was made out of softwood, and I believe that's the reason, or part of the reason, why the mortise and tenon joint fail. So for the new one, I've decided to use hardwood. It's all going to be painted, so you wouldn't know that the section that I've made is made out of different wood, but it's going to be a lot more durable. And in here I've got my 1/4" router set up for the rebates. So these are the rebates where our glass panels would sit, and I'll go over all of them and cut those rebates. As you can see, I've developed this method. I've never seen anyone else using it, but I go backwards with a router. It prevents a lot of tear out on the rebate. So what I would do is I would do a couple of passes backwards, and then I will go forward to even everything out. However, if you're going to try and do that, be very careful, because you're not supposed to be doing that. I'm doing something that is specifically not supposed to be done. It works for me, but you got to be very careful if you do that. As I said that to you before, I'm very, very stupid, and I'm also expendable, so who cares if I die? Anyways, so once we do the rebates, we have to do the decorative molding to match the rest of the window. So I've got the router set up, so that's why I was doing the rebates first. I did all of my rebates first, and then I can set up the same 1/4" router to do decorative molding. This is a piece that I run it through a jointer a couple of times, but it was a bit uneven on a couple of sides. So I thought it's going to be easier for me to just plane it by hand using my number 4 smoothing plane. So this is why I'm doing it now here. Then as you can see here, I'm doing the same piece again, and you may wonder why. It's because I've messed up the orientation of the rebate on that bottom piece. So the bottom piece on that window is slightly wider than everything else, and I've messed up the orientation of that rebate. and once you do that you can't undo it, so you have to make a new piece. But anyways, you live and learn. So here we gotta cut those 45-degree angles where our molding would meet. So I do that with my 45-degree block, which I have covered in a previous video on the make of that big glazed door. Then we can mark the position for the tenons. So first we're running a marking gauge, as I've already set it up. Then I would mark the rest of it. I would run the lines with the square, making sure that everything is nice and aligning before I start cutting it by hand. Oh, I was checking here just to make sure that it's the width of my chisel. That was by design. And then we cut the tenons by hand. So for these ones, they weren't very big tenons, so it kind of made sense to do them by hand. And then after that, we use the knife wove method to make sure that we get a nice and crisp shoulder, and then we cut the rest of it with the tenon saw. Once we get the tenon ready, we can go ahead and mark the position for our mortise. But before we do that, we have to cut the 45-degree angle for our decorative molding to meet. Now here is exactly what I'm doing. And a little bit of issue here. Sometimes when you're cutting the timber, it would release tension, it will start pinching your saw. So that's why I had to jam this chisel just to keep the cut open, so I can carry on using my little pull saw. And we clear up the cut a little bit with a chisel, and we can mark the position for mortise. What I'm doing here is I'm using the same settings on my marking gauge. Then I would offer the piece which would allow me to mark the exact position for our mortise, and then I would pre-drill most of it on the drill press. Again, this is one of the methods you can do mortise and tenon joints. What essentially you're doing here is you're just removing the majority of the material, and then you go over with a chisel and you finish it that way. You can do the whole thing by hand. However, especially on hardwoods, it's just easier to do it on the drill press. First of all, you make sure that all the holes, so as long as your drill press is set up nicely, you can make sure that your holes are perfectly at 90-degree angle going down, but then also you have less material to remove by hand. And this is what I'm doing here, cleaning up the mortise a little bit, and then this is our fit. And then once we do the 4 main mortise and tenon joints, we have to do those awkward little pieces. So I was thinking about doing mortise and tenon on them, however that wasn't going to be an option because it's too narrow of a piece. So what I ended up doing is I would cut this V groove in which the piece would sit in, and then I would drill and put a dowel as a floating tenon as an additional measure. So the V groove would prevent the piece from rotating, and then that would give us a bit of a strength on the joint, that little floating tenon. Again, I would have preferred to use mortise and tenon, however they were too small of pieces to be able to do so. Now once all of that was done, we had to cut a couple of joints to meet. So I'm not really sure what these joints are called. I would call them half lap joints because it kind of seems that way, but they may be called something different. I don't know. If you know what the name of this joint is, do let me know. So essentially we have on the thin strips, we have one that goes vertically in the middle of the window and 2 that go horizontally, and then we have to half lap joint them to meet in the middle. So this is what I'm doing here. I'm cutting the 45-degree angle, then I would trim half of one piece and then half of the other, and then you can slot them in together crosswise. You'll see that in a second. And this is how they go in together. You can see me here tapping them in together. This is the first of 2 joints, and once we have this done, that goes in the middle of our main frame, we can go ahead and assemble the whole unit. Now mind you, I did have a dry fit, however I did not film it. I didn't think that was necessary to film that, given that it's the same process just without the glue. So I thought it's going to be redundant, so I'm just filming the glue up. When it comes to assembly here, I had a little bit messed up and forgot which side of this joint was, which was the left, which was the right. When you're making stuff by hand, usually there is a difference to left and right. It's a tiny little because you hand fit those joints, and on one side they would fit slightly better than on the other. So that's, if you've ever seen on previous videos, I tend to mark my joints when I start cutting them. I would mark them. The first one will be 1 and 1 on both pieces, and then I would go over the numbers on every single joint. That will, it helps me when it comes to assembly, especially when it's something like that where it has a lot of joints. But anyways, I figured that out, and I was on to assembly. So we're applying the glue generously, as you can see. I'm applying it with my limited edition glue spreader, so please refrain from commenting on the specific tool I'm using to spread my glue. But anyways, back to the assembly. We apply the glue on all the joints, and then there's a very specific way we have to assemble this thing. So we have to use the top and bottom rail. We have to insert the middle, shall we call it grid? I'm gonna go with grid. And then after that we can put it on the side stiles. You can see here, tapping them in place, putting the other style, and then once the whole thing closes in together, we put the clamps on. And because I used a little bit too much glue, I had to wipe everything off with a cloth. But it's better to have more than needed and wipe it off than not have enough, in my opinion. Then this is the next day. So as I've spoken previously, when you're making stuff by hand, sometimes the joints are not gonna be perfectly aligning. So I would go over with a hand plane and make sure that it all aligns properly. Then once this was done and sanded, I had applied a couple of coats of primer, and then it was time to installing the glass. So because this is a traditional window, I've decided to use traditional putty. So this is a linseed oil putty, which is a big pain in the ass to work with, but anyways. Now I was trying here to show on the camera, this is a restoration glass, which is a kind of cool thing. It's slightly more expensive than the regular glass. And it's slightly wavy, and it very well matches the original Victorian glass in those windows. So I went through the trouble of getting the an appropriate glass. Few people would probably know that, but I'm one of those, so I think it's pretty cool. And then here, once we create that bed of putty for the glass, we put the glass panel in, and then we have to put a couple of pins. So those are called glazing pins to hold it in place. You got to do that very carefully, because it's a high probability that if you miss with the hammer, you can smash the glass panel. So very carefully. And then after that, it's on to applying the putty. Again, this is not my favorite process, but on this particular one, I thought it's appropriate. So we apply the putty by hand like this, and then you use a special tool called the putty knife, which is a kind of weird looking one. A lot of people don't know how to use that. It has a flat side. I have a short video you can actually watch with a bit of a close-up shot. It's taken exactly that video. So you can see here it has a flat side. So the flat side goes against the window. So that you drag it against the window, and that gives you a straight line. And it's a bit of a tedious process, but I thought it's appropriate to do it that way. The really annoying thing with putty is it takes a while to dry. It takes up to a month to dry, so that was a bit of an annoying nuisance, but anyways. So as we're getting towards the end of this video, I'd like to give credit to the people who actually watched it to the end by telling you what the cost of this whole project was. So the entire cost for our customer was about £3,500 for that whole bedroom renovation, including making of the window and everything else. I would appreciate if you leave me a comment letting me know whether you think this is expensive, cheap, or reasonably priced. However, I would kindly ask you not to put the price in the comments, so that way I would know anyone who's commented has actually watched the video to the end. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you on the next one.